I think we will get started since we have a packed agenda this evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Erin McGrath, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm the Executive Director here at Boston Partners in Education. We're excited to have so many of our partners here tonight, including an incredible panel of community leaders. I just want to take a moment to address why we're all here this evening before I turn it over to our special guests. Every summer, we look forward to hosting our annual AMP Awards ceremony when the school year ends as a way to recognize the partners who make our work possible, our mentors, our teachers, and our community and corporate leaders. Since we aren't able to do that this summer, we weren't able to do that this summer, thanks to everything going on, we thought we'd try to gather our partners together in a different way. We hope this may become the first in a series of talks about the state of education. Like the rest of the city, we've had to shift our work to an online platform. And as you probably know, the challenges of online work have been well documented. That's especially true for schools. We've seen many forums dedicated to the hardships of online learning, but relatively few talking about the solutions that have been created and the people who've made it possible for students to keep learning. Just like at our AMP Awards, we wanted to dedicate a space to celebrating the triumphs and changemakers in the city who've helped the Boston Public Schools to make the shift to remote learning. So before we jump to our panel, we'd like to take a quick minute to recognize the AMP Award winners who weren't able to be honored this past summer. These are our changemakers. And so I will just share those names with you. They are Jada Brown from the Mission Hill K-8 School. She won our Betsy A. Nelson Educator of the Year Award. Allison Gross at the Allegheny Montessori School was our John C. Rennie Mentor of the Year winner. Nick Brightstein from the Jackson Man K-8 was our Joanna Bozzato Award, which goes to a mentor who's been with us for over 5 years. Madison Park Technical Vocational High School was our Pamela Treffler School Partner Award winner. Capital One Seaport Cafe won our Nicholas A. Lepardo Corporate Partner Award. Catherine and Vincent O'Byrne from the McKinley South End Academy were our Isabel Biesecker Award winners. That is an award that honors folks who really support public education in multiple ways. And finally, Jennifer Salazar, a teacher at the Fenway High School, was our Pamela Sivens Rookie of the Year Award winner. So we just wanted to take a moment to really appreciate all of those folks. We can have a silent celebration for them. And thank you. And so thank you to all of our outstanding partners and everyone who's gone above and beyond for our students. To help guide our conversation this evening, we're honored to welcome Boston 25 News reporter Crystal Haynes. In addition to covering an equity and education series for Boston 25, Crystal has been a mentor with Boston Partners and a Big Cheese reader for many years now. She'll be asking our panelists a few questions, and then she'll open up the floor for folks to ask questions of their own. Since there are so many of us here tonight, we're going to ask that you please keep your microphones muted and type your questions into the chat during the Q&A. Thank you again for being here with us. Take it away, Crystal.
Erin, thank you so much. And it's certainly my pleasure to moderate this important panel and to celebrate all those AMP Award winners. Let's give them another little high five, applause here. The work that Boston Partners does all year round is certainly so important. And it's been my honor to be able to participate in as many years as I have. We do have an amazing panel here to talk about some of the challenges, but also some of the triumphs when we're talking about remote learning. And we know it's been a difficult year, and our teachers, our educators, our students have all been hanging in there valiantly. I want to introduce you to Jessica Tang. Jessica is the president of the Boston Teachers Union, representing over 10,000 active and retired educators. She is a middle school humanities teacher and was elected in 2017 as the first person of color, first openly queer, and first woman in over 30 years to serve as BTU president. Jessica is also a member of the Boston Partners in Education Board of Directors. Here with us also is Marty Martinez, and Marty serves as the Chief of Health and Human Services for the City of Boston. Marty oversees the expansion of youth development programming that encompasses the city's violence prevention and intervention efforts. The former CEO of Mass Mentoring Partnership, Marty is currently a mentor with Boston Partners in Education. Also with us is Kelsey Welsh. Kelsey is the Associate Creative Director for Inmar Intelligence, a longtime academic mentor with Boston Partners in Education. Kelsey has worked with the same 2 students at the Josiah Quincy School for 4 years and was one of Boston Partners' first mentors to make the jump from in-person to online mentoring with her students. And last but certainly not least is Alana Green. Alana is a 3rd grade teacher at the Henderson K-12 Inclusion School in Dorchester, an educator for 24 years. This is Alana's 8th year teaching at the Henderson. Alana currently welcomes 4 academic mentors into her online classroom each week to provide extra support for her students. She's also the parent to a BPS student matched with a Boston Partners mentor. So welcome to our esteemed panel. I'm excited for tonight's discussion. So first, again, we want to acknowledge some of the known challenges here. We know that student access to technology and Wi-Fi has been an issue. Teachers have had to learn on the fly to teach remotely for the first time, and families needing to work, care for children, and support learning simultaneously. They've all been trying to juggle all of these challenges throughout this year. I want to ask probably one of the teachers, perhaps Alana or Jessica, I want you to jump in here. What are some of the less obvious challenges for schools, students, and teachers here?
I think you touched on teachers really needing to learn a new, I guess, bag of tricks for their toolbox. And we as educators were so used to being able to give feedback right away to a student. And now we have to do it through a digital form, through Google Classroom or a Padlet or Jamboard. So that's a challenge because you want to give students instant feedback on their work. And sometimes it means having to send them an email and then follow up emails. So you don't have that connection as quickly to, correct them or give them a suggestion.
And I'll just add that in addition, and Alana's totally, I think, on point in terms of all of the instructional changes that have had to happen and really adapting from in-person learning to remote learning. But I think a lot of the challenges you don't think about are actually a lot of the logistical ones. So for example, we really had to think about as a school district, how do you, for hybrid learning, for example, get the students to school safely. And that's thinking about everything from your bus stops and socially distancing at bus stops to then getting on the bus and then getting off the bus. As educators, we think about every single moment we're with our students from the time they arrive at school to the time that they get off the school bus. And each one of those transitions are something we have to think about in great detail to the level of, for example, today I was just right before this meeting with some educators, and they were concerned about the technology and the laptops and the Chromebooks actually running out of power. And if there are extension cords in the classroom and enough power outlets for all the students who might be coming back hybrid in person to be able to keep their computers charged. That is literally the level of detail that educators are thinking about just to be able to transition from, again, in person to remote and then hybrid and then back. And we can't ignore those details because they literally can make or break a lesson. If you have a student who doesn't have their Chromebook, what do you do if it's not charged, et cetera? So those are just some examples. Oh, and I can think of a lot more, but what do you do during lunch? How do they eat together and how do you make sure that's safe? There's a lot.
Kelsey, as a mentor, what are some of the challenges you face while trying to literally connect with your students?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is finding the right ways to capture their attention and virtually, and to keep them on track with the assignments that we're supposed to be working on. that they're doing in the classroom. I think it's important to, when we went and moved to that virtual connection, to find ways to still feel like you're there for them as a different individual than their teacher. It's definitely been a challenge, especially with my two mentees, but one of the biggest things that I'll continue to reiterate is just listening to them. Sometimes they veer off topic, but they're excited and they're contributing, which is a big win when you take that learning to virtual, for them to be there and be present through the computer screen. So listening to them and then finding ways to steer them back on track or to connect what they're talking about, if it's not related to work or to homework, back to their assignment and back to what it is they're doing in the classroom. I think, this is a time that's very new for everyone, and the time where they don't have that in-person connection with people. A virtual connection, as strong as amazing as technology has gotten, is just not the same. So really encouraging them that I'm here to listen to them, that I'm not shutting them down in this world where they're feeling like they're shut out from everything. That has been one of the biggest challenges, but also one of the biggest and most fulfilling things, to see them join every week and get excited to just show up and talk about whatever it is that's exciting them at the moment.
Marty, I do want to ask you a question, because you are often the liaison between the city and parents who maybe they need resources, or the city and the school district when we're talking about these kinds of things. What are some of the less obvious challenges that the public may not know about managing this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Krista. We know how important caring adults are, whether it's a teacher, a mentor, additional supports in schools and buildings. And we know how critically important that is for families to have access to folks to be able to do that. So from Alana and Jessica and Kelsey, like the role that they're playing, whether it's virtual or in person, is so essentially important to making sure that young people have a successful experience, right? So I think about the ability to not only understand how a student's going to learn, which families want to know, especially at times like right now, but also how they're going to get those additional needs and supports met, which I think is essentially important. Having been an academic mentor at the Burke for several years, having not been able to do it this year, given everything going on, I can relate to what Kelsey said, because so much of the time I've spent with my students haven't been focused on the lesson plan, haven't been focused on the work that's in front of them. And I hate to say it to Alana and Jessica, but sometimes it's talking about the issues they have with their teacher. And so for me, it's really, how do you balance that out? And I think families want to know that young people still have those supports. The world may be, different and crazy with everything going on right now with COVID, but it's so essentially important for families that young people not only have what they're getting from their teacher, but what they're getting from, the mentors like Boston Partners and the role that they play. So it's really important.
As we talk about the factors, outside or beyond the screen that's happening, how has the election affected schools and students? I don't know if you all are hearing this in your partnership matches or in the classroom, if you've had to address some of the issues around the election.
I'm happy to take a stab at it, but I always defer to our in-classroom teachers. So Alana, feel free to jump in and weigh in. But certainly the election has been, I think, a really challenging, especially a challenging situation, because again, particularly, for example, on the day the Capitol siege happened and that coup, you wanted to be able to connect with your students who have a lot of questions and concerns, might be feeling a lot of fear, and figuring out how do you adapt your lesson the next day, age appropriately. How do you talk about difficult questions that come up around conversations about race, for example, that we need to be able to have with our students? And these are all things that if you're not trained to do well and not done don't do thoughtfully that actually can sometimes do more harm than help. And so really figuring out how to apply those lessons and what current events and what are happening to the classroom in a way that is a teachable moment, but it also is supportive of the vast array of different feelings and experiences different students of different identities may have, I think is a real challenge. And then also figuring out the restorative justice piece. And I know a lot of teachers were trying to figure out how to create a space, whether it be a circle space, to be able to process what's happening and the impacts and harm. But you know, I'm sad to say that educators have gotten used to this. So I remember when I was teaching and Sandy Hook happened, and that was like one of the first times we had to figure out, you know, how do you address this trauma that happened in a classroom the next day with your sixth graders. And I remember then we were like starting to group resources together how to do that. At this point, so many school shootings have happened and traumatic events and terrible events in our nation that educators sadly are actually almost expert at this now. We know what to do because we've had to help our students through so many traumatic events over the last years.
I would just add, exactly, Jessica. I think as an educator, we have unfortunately become very skilled on having these restorative justice conversations, having ways to allow students to be open and express their feelings. I think one thing about the election that was definitely difficult with the students, and especially the Capitol incident, is really explaining to students that they are safe. They're feeling very unsafe already with the COVID experience, with the isolation. So that kind of added to the layer of the difference between being on a Zoom and then also, unless if we were in the classroom having this conversation and being able to have some open conversation, made it more of a challenge to have that open dialogue.
I am, and Marty, I want to ask you, while we're talking about, you know, kids feeling safe in their homes or through the academic environment that's happening right now, how is the city working to address the traumatic effects of the pandemic on, you know, the students, the staff? I mean, I'm sure your staff also must be having to manage a lot as well.
Yeah, because I mean, I think I think everyone is going to have to figure out how to truly recover from not just the physical health and of what we've all encountered and continue to encounter, but the emotional health, right? So some of that has, you know, really been focused on from the Boston Public Health Commission, working sort of lift up, you know, mental health resources, doing the very best we can to sort of destigmatize people needing to reach out and ask for help, right? I mean, folks will say, you know, we don't have mental health issues, but I feel lonely, or I don't have any of, you know, that's not something I'm concerned about, but, you know, I'm pretty isolated. And so those things don't sound like mental health challenges or don't sound like issues people are facing, but we still need to connect them. So we've done a lot to kind of connect resources. So someone calls City Hall, calls 311, expresses some concerns, and we've been able to link that to some of those services across the city. And that's been important, but there's no question that it's going to be even more important as we get out of COVID. So one of the things we're looking to lift up is a sort of a multi-departmental approach around mental health wellness and recovery coming out of COVID. Not only connection to resources, especially connecting our Black and Brown communities to Black and Brown clinicians and programs and services, but also to make sure we're doing everything we can to really address what it's been like to go through COVID. COVID's been challenging for students, been challenging for teachers, been challenging for community, besides the fact that 1,100 folks have lost their lives in the city. So there's no question that it's taken a toll. I think what we've been trying to do through the city and to partner with BPS is to make sure that there are additional supports for folks as they need them. But more importantly, most of those people who need them, you don't know they need them. And so we need to make sure that it's accessible and available to folks across the board so that people can get the resources necessary to address it. And not to be afraid to talk about it because we have to be able to be clear to address it and to confront the trauma head on.
And this is for each of our panelists. How have you had to adjust in your particular roles? Kelsey, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, and to clarify, do you mean my role just in my everyday professional life, or is my role specifically as a mentor?
Probably both, because I imagine both took some
Yeah.
maneuvering.
Yeah, so I mean, the past year has been challenging for everyone. I try to humble myself, and when I get very frustrated, the lack of, for someone who's always been a non-remote worker and working in the office with all my employees and with my team that I lead, I try to remember that everyone's going through it too. I think that's the biggest humbling aspect, that we're all doing this, whereas I've had a couple of employees that work for me who have always been full-time remote, and it's an interesting dynamic now, being like, oh, I get where you're coming from. I get that this is totally different. We have to video you in all the time. As a mentor, it's definitely, selfishly, I miss that in-person communication. I would go every single weekend, see my two kids in person in the library, and we'd sit and it's definitely very different because it's become a little bit more personal. As a mentor, we always try to keep it, that level of professionalism, as I'm another adult for you, but I'm not, your friend that you call on the weekend, or you don't ask for my phone number, or want to see pictures of my dog. And now, I'm in my house and they're in their house. And so it's definitely a different level. But I think that the best thing to do is become flexible with that as mentors. Speaking to other mentors, we can't desensitize or depersonalize that. COVID has changed a lot, even for coworkers. I think it's actually brought people so much closer together in a time where we're physically apart. That's the same with mentors as well. And you have to welcome that, because those kids, they don't have that in-person connection. This is kind of going to Marty said in the mental health. My biggest concern sometimes has been, where are these kids at in their head? What is it? Not what they're learning. I know that it's a very important educational developmental time, but it's a very important personal developmental time for these kids. I happen to mentor two younger kids, but no matter what stage you are in your learning or what stage you are in your life, there is something important that's happening developmentally with you. And this is put a big kind of crutch in that regular timeline that a lot of people have, that parents have for their kids, in terms of, how is my kid socialized with other children? How does my kid socialize with people? It happens in the work environment as well. So for me, I try to think, what can I do to help them through this transition where they are physically alone, to know that they're mentally not alone, they're psychologically not alone. And also navigate the changing times. I mean, sometimes I wonder, do the kids even know what's happening? Like, what is COVID to them? Is this just, some of my mentees will be frustrated, express frustration that he can't go to the park every day. And he's like, I can't go to the park. No one wants to play with me. And, expressing to him back that it's a little bit of a different situation, but he's not alone. It's not like no one wants to play with him. It's not a personal thing. And trying to find that balance. I juggle it with work. Everyone's physically in the same place. And I think that is a huge, huge challenge, is like finding that balance. It's all about balance. And as a mentor, it's accepting that we have to be a little bit more personal. The actual right way to go about it now isn't always the way that it has always been. It's not cut them off if they ask you about your dog and their background, or ask you about your personal life or where you live. That's important. That's a connection. That's a human connection that they need right now. And I think a lot of people feel uneasy. They're like, how do I navigate this? And I've kind of just gone with it. With a kid wants to talk about what they express interest in. Same with work. You feel like you're connecting so much more with people now because people are like thriving for that personal connection. Whereas you might have had people before who are like, no, you know what, my life is separate than my work. And we all appreciate that. But to be honest, none of that is separate right now. So like we have to accept that and find a way to embrace it in a healthy way, and then allow these kids who are growing up in this lifestyle to also embrace it in a healthy way and feel like they can share that part of themselves.
Anyone else want to jump in on this?
I think probably for educators, for me especially, in March of 2020, we were all in shock. It was just instant, and we had to automatically adjust our practices, our thinking, our ways of connecting, making sure our students had technology. There were teachers that were traveling to children's homes with workbooks, and because they didn't have Wi-Fi access. And I think the big adjustment for a lot of teachers is we had to take that crisis where we were crisis teaching and spent a lot of the summer, once we knew that we weren't coming back, right away, adjusting how we did things, learning new tools, learning how to do Pear Decks and Google Classroom and Jamboards, and creating things, figuring out how we were going to support the students academically. But I also agree with Kelsey, like, we started to really have to think about their social emotional needs more than we ever have in the past. A student would come into my classroom and maybe they were crying, and you would say, "What's wrong?" "I didn't have a chance to have breakfast." "Oh, it's okay, honey. Let's go get you a milk and some cereal." And that was a fix. We have students that have food insecurity, and I can't run to the cafeteria and get them their milk. We have students who, are in very distracted households, and that's not helping. It's not supporting their social emotional needs or their education. So that's been something that we as educators have had to really learn to adapt, to find ways to connect with the students and support their social emotional needs first. It's those needs. Before I can teach you multiplication, we have to find a place in your house, even if it's in the corner, where we can have a conversation and your little brother isn't screaming. So that's been the biggest adjustment for educators, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely, I've heard this in so many places of just the really doing things differently. I was in a second grade classroom last week, and usually say, okay, take out your paper and pencil. And then if you're there and the student doesn't have your paper or pencil, you give them one, right? Or you have a routine, you have a system. But this teacher had to say, well, actually, I know you have pad of paper because I mailed pads of paper to everybody, and supplies to everyone. And while they're trying to prepare, she was on the phone while managing the classroom, the mom, to let the mom know that her child needs, the pad of paper or whatever. And it's just incredible, I think, how educators have gone above and beyond to try to meet not just the emotional needs, but the basic needs. We literally had hundreds, hundreds of educators who were helping deliver meals right at the beginning in March, for example, and over 30,000 Chromebooks. And for me, I've had to completely adjust how to support educators. So I'm in classrooms because I need to figure out how to support educators in doing something that we've never done before. And then trying to figure out, trying to learn the virus, because our knowledge of it has been changing over the last year. To learn safety, I never thought I would know the difference between air quality, ventilation, filtration, HVAC systems, and bolometers and things like that, but now I do. And just learning so much to try to be able to support our educators and our families and help them not only with their academic instruction, social emotional health, but also their basic needs, and then of course their health and safety. And so it has been just Herculean task to learn everything and try to become expert in as much as you can and rely on experts to be able to advocate for your students, families, and educators. And it is totally unprecedented. So there was no blueprint for any of this. And we're just trying to figure it out every single day.
Yeah, and I just want to chime in that I am obviously, my work is completely unrelated to everyday teachers, but watching the way that my two students who are both taught by two separate teachers are adapting to that situation, both at the end of last year when we were doing it, and now they're teachers this year. It's really remarkable because basically we're watching these teachers be total change makers, adapt to something that in a world where we don't have, it's more questions than the answers. The kids have a lot of questions. They're basically creating security in a world of insecurity. And I mean, amidst the election and that comes up, it's the same idea. And it's a question of how do you make someone find comfort in literally a world of unknown, which is the most uncomfortable thing. And it baffles me every week when I join that these two little kids are kind of feeling like, oh, I'm getting the hang of this. This is more normal. Whereas as adults, we're like, this is so abnormal. What is going on? I mean, we've been in COVID and in this quarantine situation and working remotely, depending on, your job realm. And I still don't feel like it's normal. Every single day, I'm like, what is going on? Even though I'm used to having these virtual stand-ups and everything with my teams. But the kids join and it's very comforting to see. And that's all because of the way that teachers have established is they're and adjusted to this. And to see teachers who are just like other, just like me or what have you, having so many answers when you know that they're living in the same world that we are, where there are so many non-answers. I mean, it's truly amazing. It's really admirable. I applaud it. I think that the work that you guys do with the teachers they're real change makers out there. Just having that ability to adapt when they themselves are individuals and people who are also going through the unknown of COVID. We're really all in the same boat. And then I look and I say, wow, they're really making this as normal as possible for learning for students. And that's really fascinating.
Absolutely. And as we transition to some of the triumphs, I want to bring Marty in and ask, how can we keep leading sort of changes going forward, things that possibly are working or techniques that we're using to address some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we have to, we have to sort of lean into where we have seen success and where we think things are working. One of my, a very close personal friend of mine is a teacher in Boston Public Schools. And when she has great days, I hear about it. When she has bad days, I hear about it. When she's tired of the Zoom days, I hear about it. But I think the reality is that, she always says to me that, this worked today. And so that's the thing that I'm focused on. And I think the same thing as mentors, right? Anyone who's a mentor in this call, that when you've had a really great, back and forth exchange with a student, you're like, that worked. I'm going to try that again. I'm going to keep doing that because it's helpful. And I think that's no different where we're at today, right? Jessica said it, this is unprecedented times. There's no blueprint for what we're going through or been through. There's no one way either to do everything that we're trying to do right now. So I think as we're learning as we go, we've got to lift up those places where it is working and try to figure out ways that we can strengthen that. So I just can't stress that enough, that I think trying to do that. I work in city government, which can be many times the opposite of being nimble. And so we've learned that we've had to be nimble. We've had to figure it out and lean into the places where we're working and try to strengthen the places that need more attention. So I think that's true for in the classroom, it's true for mentors, and it's really true for the work we're trying to do with families to connect them to resources.
And I definitely want to ask you all, whether it's, keeping students engaged or forming a bond with them over the camera, whether it's something that is working, on the city level and in terms of giving folks access to the resources they need right now. What is a technique that you've used that was successful?
I know for me, I've been teaching for a really long time, and it was always, if you ran into a student at the supermarket, they were like, oh, you're a real person. And yeah, I go food shopping. Now they're in my home. They're like, they see your pets, they see your children, they've met my daughter. My daughter is an 8th grader at Ladin Academy. They've even helped me wake her up in the morning when she needs to get to her classes. We go in with the little computer and we all yell, wake up. She hates that. But for me to connect with them, I had to kind of, take my wall down a little bit and really show them, I have good days, I have bad days, just like you. We do a check-in in the morning, we have breakfast together. Funny story, this morning I said to them, I woke up, it was cold, it was snowy, I'm having soup for breakfast. And then we went into this whole conversation. The kids were talking about how some of them like to have, all these crazy things like pizza for breakfast. And it helps you connect with them. I've met their pets, I've met their parents, I've seen their bedrooms, I've seen their stuffed animal collections. And I think that is something that I'm going to take in, even when we're back, to be able to have that real world connection with them.
I hope it's appropriate to do this, but I would love to hear from some of the educators and maybe mentors in the chat too about what your triumphs are, because I do feel that there are a lot. Some of the ones I've heard, for example, are about strengthened relationships actually between educators and parents, and that it's the strongest, parent-teacher involvement they've ever had. And I've also heard success stories in terms of remote learning for some of the students who are more shy actually in person, and that they participate more actually virtually for a lot of different reasons. English learners, for example, have benefited, in fact, on some of the remote learning because in English learning acquisition, there's something called the affective filter, and you have to lower your filter in order to practice speaking in another language. And for whatever reason, virtually, they've been able to lower their affective filter and actually participate more. And that's how they gain their skills. And English learners as speakers conversationally so those are some of the examples. And then also the technology. I think it's forced educators to have to learn new applications and all these so many applications. I remember in March and February, I had a whole list of 50 different applications. And now a lot of those applications I think can be still used in being able to either get efficient feedback for students or do more assessments, quick assessments on learning that they weren't able to use before. So I think there's certainly been a lot of learning and growth, and those are the triumphs. And then the last thing I'll add too is just the goodwill. So shout out actually to the Boston Partners in Education Board that raised, I forget how much money, but it was a lot of money to help provide supplies at our back to school fair. So we continued our back to school fair. We gave out our 50,000 books, and then BPE was able to help fundraise all of these supplies because again, that was a huge challenge where students didn't necessarily have the supplies they needed at home, and we couldn't easily distribute them. And so I think the amount of goodwill and just partners trying to figure out how to adapt to support educators and students and families as we were all trying to adapt has been one of the silver linings for sure.
Something I've done, and obviously not as a teacher, but it kind of relates to what Alana said. Something we do, me and my 2 mentees, every time I meet with them individually, is I just ask, what are you excited about right now? I ask that, and then I tell them what I'm excited about. And it sometimes is something that they're doing in class. I will admit, sorry teachers, that a lot of times it's not something that they're doing in class, but that's okay because it's literally, I ask, sometimes it's this little boy that I mentor, it's the fact that out of a Nutella box where you get like a bunch of Nutella in bulk, he made these cool goggles and he put them on and showed me. And I was like, you know what? Like that is pretty cool. And for me, I'll be like, I organized my snack drawer. I'm like, what do you mean? And like, why'd you do that? And we have like a conversation. I find that everything, if they're excited about something, it ties back to, in some way, an educational element. You know, the ability I was actually fascinated about these goggles. They were like they weren't crooked. Like my own glasses by Warby Parker are crooked. So I was like, how did you make these? Let's talk about it. There's thought that goes into everything. Just asking, what are you excited about right now, to your students or to your mentees, to your own kids. I mean, I don't have children, but to anyone, it's amazing to see they're like, oh, you care. There's this like connection. And it always is something that yields this it gets our conversation, it gets our session started off right. Sometimes it ties into what they're learning in class. But I would say for anyone who feels that they're struggling with that connection, ask that question and see what they say. And if they're like, nothing, then I try to like poke and prod and see like, there's gotta be something. Like there's gotta be something right now that is you're looking forward to. Maybe it's getting outside later. But that is a good like conversation starter, and it has worked every time. And I find that now the kids expect me to ask that. They're like, oh, I know what I'm excited about. And they like have something queued up and ready to go. And then boom, we're off and running with like this student who might be more introverted is just like really excited to open up. But I think that's a great thing that's worked for me personally. I think it's a nice trick. And it's not like, what excites you about math or what excites you about, this book we're reading. I mean, I would get if nothing excites you about math, but it's nice. It's sometimes I'm surprised that it is something that you know what? I learned a multiplication trick, or I solved a Rubik's Cube, which for like a fourth grader, I'm like, okay, well, that is super exciting. But asking that question is a great way to just kind of like ignite a fire that they might not have lit at the moment.
I want to read a couple of the responses because Jessica kind of opened it up to folks here on the chat. And Daniel Kirshner says that his AP research student at O'Brien has been engaged with her project, open to questions, and not shy about suggesting ways to address the challenges of her project. Now, a lot of folks have also put that one of the downsides is that they have limited time to have a dialogue, so it goes by really quickly. And some folks are having trouble, really connecting with students who are used to connecting with them one-on-one. One, David Miller said that he finds that as I assume an educator, they're able to sort of shift into the mentor role because they have to address things like your little brother comes on camera or your mother turns on the vacuum cleaner during school. And it helps jumpstart a conversation about how things are going on in the home for students. And so you're able to use that transition there. So just some things that folks are experiencing out there. I also want to encourage everyone on the call here to put your questions into that chat too, because in just about 5 minutes, we're going to start taking audience questions as well. But I do want to get back to some of the questions that I have. Part of the reason of why you all are on the panel is because you consider, because Boston Partners considers you changemakers. I consider you changemakers for education and remote learning in the city. Are there other changemakers that you would like to give a shout out to for their work this year? Like, do you guys know folks who are really like crushing it and making this experience, better for students?
I could name so many teachers across the district, but teachers in my building who, some of them might be on the call, who are just amazing with sharing resources. We've always been a problem-solving culture where you might share a different resource, but people who are like, I found this, or I found this blog, or I've created this peer deck, I've created these Padlets. And I know one teacher, she's a second grade teacher in my school, Mary O'Brien, I think she's on the call. She has been amazing supporting parents and students and going by their house with craft activities that they can do together, with supplies for science experiments that they can all participate in. So I think it's just amazing how, Jessica said it earlier, how some teachers have just adapted their practices completely and have really worked together to collaborate and to problem solve and support parents. Because we also have to know that a big part of this is educators connecting with the families too, because we need them. We need that mom to go get that math book that I know because I dropped it off at your house. It's there. And or we need that. I had a student one time who was like, I don't know how this pencil sharpener works, or the technology goes down. So we need to have that connection with parents, and they need support too, because sometimes they can't academically understand the work that the student is doing. So I think there are so many change makers that are also really supporting families and parents out there.
Yeah, and if I could add to what Alana said about who sort of those change makers are, parents and teachers. But I'm gonna take it to the nonprofit route and lift up Boston Partners and other organizations that are really stepping in. I mean, they're really, they're stepping in to keep their services going, to keep their work happening without the benefits of being able to have all their fancy chicken dinners to raise money and to make that happen in difficult financial times. And I won't underplay that. I mean, I think I'm a nonprofit guy who just happens to be working at city government. And we could not do what we need to do for youth and families in the city of Boston without nonprofits, without their leadership, without their volunteers, without all that they do to supplement what BPS can do, supplement what teachers can do, supplement what leadership can do. So I can't overstate that. I mean, nonprofits have continued to be essential. And I think we all think of that word a little differently now than we probably ever have before on what is essential. And so I just want to lift up the leadership of Boston Partners in Education, as well as all those nonprofits that COVID hasn't stopped their work or their mission, and they continue to be change makers. So just want to add that to the mix.
Yeah, I will echo that, the nonprofit partners and just, again, the goodwill from so many people, and it comes in unexpected places too. We have for example, retired teachers chapter, and usually they have these annual banquets where the retired teachers will come together. But since they couldn't have any of their events this year, they actually ended up donating all the funds that they would usually use on their activities to the Greater Food Bank, and they donated actually $30,000 to the Greater Boston Food Bank. And so there's just so many different ways that folks have adapted in different places to support. But I do have to give a special shout out to educators and parents, because it has been such a hard year. And I've heard from so many teachers and parents, and teachers who are parents, who feel like they're not doing anything well. They're like, I feel like I'm a bad teacher, and I feel like I'm a bad parent. And I have to just remind everyone that, everyone is trying their best. And, some folks came into their technology proficiency at different places. And so, maybe they're, and some people started off as Zoom masters, right? And so everyone is trying their very best. And I just think that absolutely matters. And parents, they're trying their best. Teachers are certainly trying their best. Teachers are trying to be both, everyone's trying to be both, parents who are trying to work at the same time too. And this has just been such a challenging year, and just to acknowledge that everyone is doing their best, and your best is enough.
I do want to spend some time with some of the questions we've gotten from the audience. And one of our first questions is for Jessica and/or Marty. Can you talk about ways that remote learning has supported advancing equity in education, or how your work has put that in focus?
Marty, do you want to go first?
Right ahead, Jessica.
Well, equity is actually the lens through which we have to look at everything in this district, because unfortunately, public education is one of those systems that has been inequitable for decades. And if you don't look at your response through a lens of equity, then you're exacerbating the inequity. And so, we really had to think long and hard about, which it was inequitable. For example, which schools had HVAC systems and which didn't, is inequitable. Which schools had, more access to social workers and guidance counselors and which didn't. Literally every decision that this district makes, if it's not through a lens of equity, then there's a very serious potential harm of exacerbating the inequities, which we already knew existed, so I have to say, the Student Opportunities Act has been something we've been advocating for, because there's been underfunding of Boston Public Schools for over 30 years, since the 1993 Education Reform Act. And today the governor's budget came out, and last year we were supposed to get over $200 million to try to make up the inequities of funding. Those inequities absolutely break down on racial lines, on income lines in the district. And while remote learning, again, I think there have been a lot of bright spots, and I don't want to say that it's been a failure, because I actually think people worked so hard to get high quality remote education at this point in the year. But overall, a lot of inequities have been exacerbated. And if we're not acknowledging that and thinking forward about how to address those inequities, then we're actually further exacerbating what already existed that was not okay.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I would add to that, and agree with most of the points that Jessica made, is that I think that you have to have an equity lens, but I think in times during COVID, I think arguments can be made that the same decision is equitable to some and then feels inequitable to others. And I think those are the times that we're in. I mean, we're in times where there are difficult decisions being made about how to, and some of the comments in the chat, how can we return students into classrooms, the need that students have to be in classrooms, meeting with teachers, the need to make sure that we prioritize safety in the face of a hopefully once in a lifetime pandemic that we hopefully won't face again. But I think the reality is that you have to think about the disproportionate impact. Who's been impacted? How have they been impacted? And then you work for solutions to try to do that. And usually what you have to do is, as I would argue, is the Chief of Health and Human Services, it's the work of the part of government I oversee, is to make sure we're breaking down barriers for those that are impacted the most. And that then will impact and support the rest. And so I think that's a really important piece. It can't just be focused on, one sliver or one slice or one perspective. You really have to look at where the impact is the most disproportionate. And I think that's what we have to continue to do. As Jessica said, COVID sort of took a bright light and shined it heavily on many of the inequities that exist. And if we leave COVID and we survive and we get vaccinated and we sort of turn the page and don't look at those inequities and try to address the systemic barriers that are there, then we really didn't learn the lesson that we needed to learn. And that, to me, is what we really need to make sure we focus on while we try to get through COVID, that we try to recover in a much more equitable way than we entered it.
We are getting a lot of questions about reopening schools and what that looks like. But I think the overarching question is if whether you're going whether you're in full remote or I'm sorry, whether you're in a hybrid or you're in a full reopening, what does a successful transition look like? And I'm pointing to the educators here. What does that look like, where we can successfully be in the classroom safely, have a hybrid option for students that need it? And then Marty, I'll have you jump in after that too, because I think a lot of folks are eager to have that addressed on the city side too.
I think a successful opening, I know Jessica spoke, we definitely want to focus on making sure everyone is safe. And also that we're addressing the students' mental health needs too in this whole process. Students have been home, some of them for over a year. Some of them have been in homes where language isn't strong, or when we talk about inequities, they've seen the inequities, and we need to get these students to start collaborating working in groups. That's going to be a challenge. It's a challenge on Zoom. We put them in breakout groups with each other, but that idea of they've been very isolated, and to now move to being in a classroom where we are still going to have some students in the classroom, some are going to be on Zoom. We do have quite a large population of students in Boston who right now live in neighborhoods where their families do not feel comfortable having them come into the school yet. So we need to, as educators, make sure that those students are academically and socially, emotionally getting what they need, as well as the students in front of us.
So yeah, this is like, I think, the question that we have trying to been figuring out, how do you bring back as many students as possible for in-person education, particularly for those who have not been able to access remote learning? Because I want to again emphasize that there are a lot of students actually are doing really well with remote learning, all things considered, right? But there are certainly students, particularly high needs special education students, who can't access remote learning in the same way. So how do we bring back those students and educators as quickly and safely as possible? So that in a way in which the risk, because there'll always be risks, are mitigated, and that the benefits outweigh those risks. And that is not an easy answer. But that is the key to reopening, is that we are doing it in a way that does not unnecessarily put anyone at risk, whether it be students, educators, or their families, because COVID is happening, in our communities, in our schools.
Jessica,
And
I just want Marty has a hard out at 6, so I just want.
and he should answer that question, because he's a major decision maker there. So please go ahead. I saw the.
No, I mean, I think that's the genesis of the point here, is that, figuring out how to get to a place where people are getting their needs met as we live with COVID. Right. I mean, this is a reality that we all have, right? And no one here wants to be wearing a face covering, socially distancing themselves, and not spending time with people we care about, or getting our needs met. And that's the balance of the decision making that we're trying to make here. I'll leave you sort of with this piece. We make decisions all the time through city government, and we get 150 emails for that decision and 150 emails against that decision, and both will make the case that this is the most inequitable decision we've ever made, and this is the most equitable decision we've ever made. And I think right now in these times, difficult decisions are what you have to make, while we try to balance out what is just a time that I hope none of us ever have to face again. But I do think we're going to get to a place where we get past these challenges, and where people can build those connections and those relationships. I'm a mentoring guy at heart. That's why I've been connected to Boston Partners for many, many years. And I care deeply about the ability for people to get those personal connections and relationships that they need, especially our students in our Boston Public Schools. So we have to do everything we can to centralize students and what their needs are. And that's how I see my work. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Marty. And I know there are a ton more questions that are in the chat right now. We're going to have breakout sessions after this, after the panel too, to further break this down, answer some of your questions. But I just want to, as we wrap up this portion of the panel, I want to ask you all, what are some things you're excited about once we get back to normal? Right? Like what are some things you're excited about doing with your students or your mentor or your mentees once we get back to normal?
Maybe giving them a hug or a high five when that's allowed. I think probably the one thing I'm really excited about is meeting my students. I have never met this class of students face to face. I ran into one student. I brought them their supplies, and they came out of the house, and I didn't realize he was so little, because you only see their face. So I'm really excited to meet my students and see them. And I'm excited for them to have the opportunity to meet each other. I just got a new student today, And you can imagine you're transferring from another Boston public school into my classroom with 21 other students. And I'm excited for them to start to be able to make those connections, those personal connections again.
Kelsey, Jessica?
I think yeah, I'm looking forward to educators and parents honestly having a little more joy and a little less burden on their shoulders. I deeply feel for just the challenges of this year, and um, again, we've talked about the social emotional impact. I do think it's really real, and I've seen some of the questions in the chat around loneliness. I think it's not just for our students. I think it's for a lot of our parents and adults who have felt very isolated too, while trying to process so much of the challenges of this year, not just professionally but personally, politically, electorally, et cetera. It's been a lot. And so my hope is that when we're able to get back to some sense of normalcy, that we can address, I think, a lot of those burdens that people have really been holding, and start some healing. And also with the urgency of knowing that returning to what was pre-pandemic was not working for a lot of our students and families too. And so normalcy can't be going back to what was, but normalcy in the terms of being able to have those in-person relationships and supports, and I think feeling less isolated. And we all carry each other's burdens, right? So what Kelsey said earlier about children, like, no one wants to play with me, or no one wants to be my friend, or like not. I think that is something I'm looking forward to, hoping that sense of love and belonging and community can be restored in a way that hasn't been able to be replicated fully, I think, virtually.
Yeah, and I'll add real quick that I think what I'm looking forward to is that burden of, for mentors, for teachers, for parents, for all educators, lifting of that worry about the isolation. I know in the chat someone had mentioned the suicides of students in Nevada, and so it's this weird balance that we're going to have to take, because COVID, I don't think is going to, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I don't think it's going to completely disappear anytime soon. So as we start to reopen, we'll have a burden lifted of students and children aren't in isolation anymore. Therefore, their safety in that sense, maybe hopefully will lift a little bit. But then of course we now have a new safety concern. I think that in response to that and isolation, we can only teach kids if there are kids to teach. And that's kind of where I hope that burden is lifted, or that extra worry, because there's so many other worries right now. So that feeling of isolation hopefully going away for students, because we can meet with them for an hour or 2 hours every week. Educators obviously for the many hours during the day, but we don't know, and they can tell us how they're feeling, but we don't know what they feel when they walk away from the computer screen, or really where they're at when they aren't face-to-face with us virtually. We get a much better sense when we're with them in person. We're trying to breach that gap. We can't reach out and give them a hug, or put our hand on their shoulder and say, really, how are you feeling? So we can only do so much virtually. I think people are doing a great job, but it's lifting of that burden of that isolation that inevitably is there, even when we try to eliminate it right now virtually.
Well, I want to thank you all for your time. Audience, please don't go anywhere because we are going to go into those breakout rooms, and Erin or a staff person from the Boston Partners in Education will explain that a little bit to you. But for now, I'm Crystal Haynes from Boston 25 News. Thank you so much for allowing me to, facilitate this conversation that's so important, and that hopefully, we'll be able to be in person again and be excited about being together in the same way that we were before all of this. But thank you for the work that you do, and folks who are on the call and folks who are in the chat, thank you for sticking in there.
All right, thank you all. That was a wonderful panel. I think there was a lot of insight and I really appreciate you all. So thank you, Alana, Kelsey, Jessica, Marty, and Crystal. For those who can continue to join us in the breakout, and we'll continue the conversation for a bit.